We have Kanzi. He's mastered 200 lexical tokens, an incredible feat. And Ed Witten unleashed the second superstring revolution. If we look under the hood, this is what we find. Basically the same thing. Right? One is a little larger. It maybe also has a few tricks in the exact way it's wired. These invisible differences cannot be too complicated, however, because there have only been 250,000 generations since our last common ancestor, and we know that complicated mechanisms take a long time to evolve. So a bunch of relatively minor changes take us from Kanzi to Witten, from broken-off tree branches to intercontinental ballistic missiles. So this then seems pretty obvious that everything we've achieved, pretty much, and everything we care about depends crucially on some relatively minor changes that made the human mind. And the corollary, of course, is that any further changes that could significantly change the substrate of thinking could have potentially enormous consequences. Some of my colleagues think we are on the verge of something that could cause a profound change in that substrate, and that is machine superintelligence. A couple of years ago, we did a survey of some of the world's leading AI experts to see what they think, and one of the questions we asked was, by which year do you think there is a 50% probability that we will have achieved human-level machine intelligence? We defined human level here as the ability to perform almost any job at least as well as an adult human, so real human level, not just within some limited domain. And the median answer was 2040 or 2050, depending on precisely which group of experts we asked. Now, it could happen much, much later or sooner. Like, truth is, nobody really knows. Right? What we do know is that the ultimate limits to information processing in machine substrate lie far outside the limits in biological tissue. This comes down to physics. A biological neuron fires maybe at 200 hertz, 200 times a second. But even a present-day transistor operates at a gigahertz. Neurons propagate slowly in axons, 100 meters per second tops. But in computers, signals can travel at the speed of light. There are also size limitations, like a human brain has to fit inside a cranium, but a computer can be the size of a warehouse or larger. So the potential for superintelligence kind of lies dormant in matter, much like the power of the atom lied dormant throughout human history, patiently waiting there until 1945. In this century, scientists may learn to awaken the power of artificial intelligence. And I think we might then see an intelligence explosion. You could run a kind of counterfactual thought experiment and think back 100 years ago or 80 years ago, before nuclear weapons had been invented. And you can ask yourself, what would have happened if it had turned out that instead of requiring highly enriched uranium or plutonium, like really difficult processes to unleash the power of the atom, what if there had been some simple way? Something like baking sand in your microwave oven or something like that, right? So now we know that you can't have a nuclear weapon by baking sand in your microwave oven, but before we did the relevant physics, how could we have known how it would turn out? Like, it could have turned out like that, and in that scenario, that might well have been the end of human civilization at that point, because if anybody, just by doing some simple thing that they can do in their kitchen, could wield the destructive power to kill millions, then it might just be impossible to have cities and concentrated population and so forth. But nuclear energy turned out not to be a black ball, but maybe a gray ball instead. So it looks like our strategy currently is to continue to pull balls out of this urn and just hope that there isn't a black ball in there, because if there is, we will eventually pull it out, and then that will be the end of it. We have a lot more ability to invent things than to uninvent things. So this is a general reason also for thinking that the biggest existential risks over the course of a century might be from possible future discoveries that we might make. And I've put up a partial list here of some of the perhaps more likely candidates for areas where existential risks might emerge. There are several things to notice about this. There's also all of these technologies here have great potential for beneficial uses, which paradoxically is one of the factors that makes them go higher up on this list, because it increases the likelihood that we will actually develop them. If there was some technology whose only use was to cause destruction of humanity, then maybe we would have a greater likelihood of steering clear of that. But if it's something that has wide beneficial impacts for health and environment and economy, chances are we will eventually develop these. Another thing to notice about this is that at the bottom there I've put in some unknowns. So if you think again back 100 years ago and consider what the answer would have been if you at that time would have asked what are the biggest existential risks over the next couple of centuries, then none of the ones that we might now be tempted to put near the top of this list would have been mentioned. I mean, certainly not machine intelligence, that didn't have computers. Synthetic biology wasn't a concept. Nanotechnology was not a concept. They might have worried some about totalitarian tendencies, but for the most part, what now seems to be the biggest risks are ones that have only in recent decades popped up on the radar, and there might yet be others that we haven't yet conceived of. Suppose we give an AI the goal to make humans smile. When the AI is weak, it performs useful or amusing actions that cause its user to smile. When the AI becomes super intelligent, it realizes that there is a more effective way to achieve this goal. Take control of the world and stick electrodes into the facial muscles of humans to cause constant beaming grins. Take another example. Suppose we give AI the goal to solve a difficult mathematical problem. When the AI becomes super intelligent, it realizes that the most effective way to get the solution to this problem is by transforming the planet into a giant computer so as to increase its thinking capacity. And notice that this gives the AIs an instrumental reason to do things to us that we might not approve of. Human beings in this model are threats. We could prevent the mathematical problem from being solved. Now, of course, presumably things won't go wrong in these particular ways. Right? These are cartoon examples. But the general point here is important. If you create a really powerful optimization process to maximize for objective X, you better make sure that your definition of X incorporates everything you care about. Let me ask again, how many know about AlphaGo or follow that some degree of, maybe most, well, half. So this was the system, again, built by Google DeepMind, and they decided to allocate some engineers to trying to create an agent that could do well on this traditional Asian board game Go, which is sort of in Asia what chess is in the West, except it's even bigger. It has a longer tradition, more professional players. It's just an even bigger deal. And it's been hard for computers to do this. Chess was kind of mastered in when was it, the 90s or something, with Deep Blue. Go is harder because you really need visual intuition to be able to perform well at this. And so in October 2015, one version of AlphaGo had played a practice game against a European Go player. And Lee Sedol, who was the human champion that AlphaGo was going to go up against, had observed this initial practice match, and he says that based on the level I've seen in this match against the European player, I think I will win the game against AlphaGo by near a landslide. This is in October 2015. Then in February 2016, Lee Sedol says, I have heard that Google's AlphaGo is surprisingly strong and getting stronger, but I'm confident that I can win at least this time. Then in March, the game starts, so it's best of 5, so you have to win 3. So March 9th, after the first game, I was very surprised because I didn't think I would lose. March 10th, I'm quite speechless. I'm in shock. I can admit that the third game is not going to be easy. It's starting to dawn that this AlphaGo is quite a formidable opponent. Then after the third match, he lost the challenge. Says, I felt kind of powerless. It's interesting here to look at the timeline. So we have in 2015, in October, a system that is good at Go, but nowhere near the top of the human competence ladder, easily defeated. And I think that Lee Sedol was right, that if he had gone up against the October 2015 system, he would have won by a landslide. 6 months later, you have a system that is superhuman. So what this suggests is that the answer to this question, what happens if we achieve human-level AI, is, I think, superintelligence. And possibly it happens fairly shortly after we have human-level AI. So you have to distinguish these two questions. There's one question, how far are we now from having human-level AI? And I said there's great uncertainty about that. Some number of decades, who knows? It's probably going to take quite a while. It's difficult. That's one question. And I think we should have a wide probability distribution of that. But then there's this other different question, which is, if and when we get there, how soon will we then get to superintelligence? And I think that could happen quickly. Now, maybe it will take hours, maybe it will take weeks, maybe months or years, but I don't think decades at that point after you have human level. What I have argued, and I recently wrote a book on this, is that we then will confront this control problem, which is the problem of assuming you could solve the intelligence problem, like how could you actually make machines intelligent, like how could you then ensure that these very intelligent machines will be safe and beneficial to humanity? And I argue that this raises unique challenges, technical challenges and foundational challenges, that there are plausible scenarios in which superintelligent systems become very powerful. For the reasons I alluded to earlier, like intelligence is a general purpose thing. If you have enough intelligence, you can invent all the other technologies you don't already have. And also, as I describe in the book, there are these superficially plausible ways of solving the control problem. Ideas that immediately spring to people's mind that on closer examination turn out to fail. And so there is this open, currently unsolved problem of how to develop better control mechanisms. That is more difficult because it will need to be solved before we actually have these fully intelligent systems. By that time, we already need to have the solution. So I'm very glad that people like Elon Musk are stepping into the breach here, where there has been a complete funding vacuum until recently, and that some activity is beginning to happen. And I recommend that that we sort of accelerate this work of establishing a field of inquiry to do foundational and technical work on the control problem, and recognize that as such a distinct, legitimate academic endeavor that some small number of the world's best brains should be working on, just as so many other things are being studied by academics. That we should try to attract top mathematics and computer science talent into this new field. That we should build strong research collaborations between the AI safety community and the AI development community, both in industry and academia, because ultimately the path to success is that whatever ideas for safety are developed also get implemented, and both of these need to learn from one another rather than take up antagonized positions. Once there is superintelligence, the fate of humanity may depend on what the superintelligence does. Think about it. Machine intelligence is the last invention that humanity will ever need to make. The machines will then be better at inventing than we are, and they'll be doing so on digital timescales. What this means is basically a telescoping of the future. So think of all the crazy technologies that you could have imagined maybe humans could have developed in the fullness of time. So cures for aging, space colonization, self-replicating nanobots, or uploading of minds into computers. All kinds of science fiction stuff that's nevertheless consistent with the laws of physics. All of this, a superintelligence could develop, and possibly quite rapidly. Now, a superintelligence with such technological maturity would be extremely powerful. And at least in some scenarios, it would be able to get what it wants. We would then have a future that would be shaped by the preferences of this AI.